Okay, fair enough. Is that better then? Can you hear me now? Okay, in the back. This idea that that we need to pay attention more to performance, and we need to pay particular attention to the performance of people, I think is actually the next generation of buildings. And as I mentioned yesterday, and I'll get into a little bit more, this availability of data, which follows a number of trends: big data, revolution of the cheap, environmental mapping. It opens a lot of possibilities, and it really raises questions about, as I ended yesterday, would you continue to pursue the same strategy if people knew how your buildings performed? And I think the answer to that is probably no. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't get a certification, but it would mean that how you spent your money and what you focused your money on would fundamentally change. And when we did this report, I didn't mention yesterday, but I should have, that this report follows a trajectory in the industry. So if you look at what real estate professionals are saying that they want out of a sustainable building, it used to be energy. It used to be energy efficiency. And the amount of people saying that that was their priority has declined. And what has increased is the number of people saying, I want that, don't get me wrong, I still want my energy efficiency, but I want a building which enables me to accomplish my mission. And that sits very nicely in this conference here. And it sits very nicely in the measurement of the human performance and the experience. So before this report was written in 2014, there was a business case for green buildings report put out by the World Green Building Council in 2013. The most looked at chapter of that report was the one on health and well-being. So we knew we were going to get somewhere. I want to come to noise and acoustics and spend a little bit of time on this today. I've already given you an overview of the report yesterday. You can see that of the 9 factors that we isolated to look at objectively as physical features of the environment that would have an impact on people's performance. And these are in no particular order, but noise and acoustics, you can see that we call them both. I think we probably should just have called it acoustics. You learn something in a couple of days, don't you? That's what I would call it. But I was quite taken yesterday, just as an aside. I can tell you when we were thinking about this in terms of the health, well-being, and productivity, we were clearly thinking of acoustics in the productivity effects. And yesterday's film trailer about the health effects, I think, opens new possibilities, because actually one of the things you can do with the apps and you can do with the new technology is measure side by side very easily now, and companies are doing this, particularly with physical trackers. If they create open stairwells, are their employees walking more? You can clearly see, is there a physical effect on the human body which is related to the acoustics within the room? And I didn't know that before yesterday, and I'm willing to bet that is the case, and I'd be interested in looking at that. I talked about this yesterday. I don't want to say too much more than that, other than it's meant to be not just the physical environment, and that's also something which has come up here, that people have a different reaction to the same environment. And in fact, people have a reaction to, the same people have a different reaction depending upon what they bring, where they are, what kind of mood they're in. And we were talking before, I think it's interesting about, and I'm looking forward to the healing office, because you always hear in regard to this, well, people are complicated, and what good can an office do when they're complicated? But they've got management problems, they've got personal issues. When we were doing the report, we realized that actually, if you had a window seat, for example, you would sleep on average an hour more in the evening. So the way to flip this around, and that's all about having access to outside the daylight and the circadian rhythms. I think the question, as we keep redefining, as we do in sustainability, is not what people bring to the office and what the office might do to them, but actually what people take from the office and how that might play out in the rest of their lives. Because there is, as we learned yesterday, a lasting effect of place on people. One of the things I will take from this is you'll see that we're now calling it noise. On the bottom there, when we thought about this, we thought about measuring it objectively. So the measure is meant to be sort of a number, and the assess is much more of a sort of perceptual understanding of of how that works. I think we need to, and the reason why we do the perception survey is to be able, obviously, to figure that out. But I actually think that as we go forward on this work, and there is an opportunity here, I think a number of you have expressed interest in working on the green building. We're putting together briefing notes around each one of these categories, and so clearly I'm not an expert in acoustics, but we need that kind of expertise. So just as a little bit of plug, if you're interested in doing that, and there is an opportunity there. And I won't say too much about the financial metrics. I'm just giving you sort of an overview, and then I'll jump into something around the measurements that we've had. It'd be interesting to see where acoustics falls into this, because typically these are rather broad categories which you sort of try and correlate to the physical environment. And I'd be interested in which one of these you would see acoustics fit into most closely. And maybe we can talk about that in the workshop. I know clearly that when we've looked at this, staff retention and might be one area where that would be, and certainly certainly physical complaints about the building seems another area for that. I will tell you that we started to look at other buildings, and when you use social media, which I'll talk about in a minute, you don't hear you don't see too much social media about offices at the moment, but you see a lot of it about retail. And the two things which pop up in retail as complaints in social media about place are cleanliness and noise. So what does it look like when we put these monitors, which you mentioned in your question, into buildings? And I went back, because we've done this now in a couple of dozen buildings at this point, and you'll have a better sense of what these numbers represent than I do. But I just grabbed a representative sample of a random representative sample of about 5,000 readings, and my eyeballing of this tells me that actually those numbers are pretty good. Is that with the exception of the 70 and above? So you're finding most of this is noise. This is decibels. Excuse me, I should have said that. Yeah, and that is those are mostly open plan offices. It's pretty good, isn't it? Yeah, that's. Yeah. But the reason why we did the model the way we did, because you could be looking at this and say, well, I think that building is fine. But of course, it all depends on, you have to double check with the perception, which we'll come to in just a second. So this is what we typically get. Again, this is just one of the surveys that I've done, but I tried to grab something which was representative. And mostly when you conduct a survey of people in an office, and this one is about 500 people, you tend to get a bell-shaped curve. So most people have been, and when we've done the perceptual study of how do you feel about this, and I should say, we always ask a particular question about the physical feature, because that's more important than saying, how does this office make you feel? Or do you think this office will make you be productive? So that you can begin to isolate what it is. And it'll be no surprise to you, you always get the most complaints around temperature. I mean, that's the highest one always. And noise or acoustics tends to look like this. Something we hadn't anticipated, and I think actually is the way going forward, enabled by apps and enabled by actually smartphones, when you can begin to see what people are experiencing environmentally and perceptually based on where they are. The interesting thing, in the same way that we asked companies to look at their assets on an asset-by-asset basis, which they almost never do, I think the real trick on this going forward is being able to isolate where the problems are in buildings on a floor-by-floor or an area-by-area basis, which typically hasn't been done. I'm sure you do it routinely, actually, as part of when a problem has been identified and you need to come in and fix it. But for most offices, we don't know what they're like in particular areas. And actually the goal of this is to be able to map some of that. So when you conduct a perceptual survey and you leave to me, which is the most important item in any survey, the most important question isn't a question, it's a box. And you say, can you tell us how you feel about this? You'll actually get more comments in that than anywhere else. But when you begin to link the physical and the perceptual, you'll see that even if you get that bell-shaped curve, even if you get those sort of relatively good numbers objectively measured by a cube, you do find problem spots. And it's no surprise. People will say where they They can't have a phone conversation. The center sections, kitchen areas are always a problem by printers and so on. So what this allows you to do, and companies are beginning to do this, is they're beginning to go back and retrofit and put their copiers all in one area or away from people. They're allowing people who, and you're beginning to see this, they're finding out what people like and where they're comfortable and moving them as you suggested yesterday. So more extrovert type people can be in areas where the office is. This works in all kinds of areas. It's not just noise, it's also in terms of temperature. So you can begin to, quite sensibly in a low-cost way, just put people where they're most comfortable. And interestingly enough, when we've done this, you'll always get the complaints in a help desk or help log about it's too hot, I'm too cold. And normally that's chalked up to people having preferences or male-female kind of thing that you're all familiar with. But actually, if you go in and you measure these things with the cubes, you find actually there's a lot of evidence to that there are lots of hot and cold spots even within floors. So why isn't this more common? Well, all kinds of barriers which we're trying to now think about. When you're building a building, obviously short-term thinking. I liked how Anna was talking about investors looking at this and the risk involved with producing a building, which has to be healthy for longer-term goals. And we're trying to get past this, and particularly the one that's for me up there, which is most important, is obviously the tick box approach. When we were writing this report, many of you will be familiar with this big gap between design and performance. It was right at the time where the first LEED Platinum skyscraper in New York City, which is the Bank of America building, which had Al Gore as its tenant and was a big deal. The governor of that state passed a law which said you actually have to tell us what the energy performance of your building is. And a year later, that building was the worst energy performer in all of New York City. And that's not an isolated example by any stretch, and it's not meant to pick on the Bank of America building. It's just we aren't very good at checking our work. And increasingly, people will be able to check the work, and that, I think, is quite a hopeful thing for me. I just wanted to flag this up to let you know where the work is going. There's now a 2-year campaign, which is spun off from the office's report, which is beginning to look at retail. And retail, as I mentioned yesterday, is to me infinitely more interesting because it can potentially reveal a lot more about people. Where people shop is different from where people work. And we're asking retailers who called right after that report dropped in, they said, we know productivity is the weakest link of an office report because it's how do you measure productivity? What you're measuring is sort of proxies for productivity. The retailers are beginning to fill this in. And I actually think that this is the interesting part here because we're no longer talking just about cost. We're talking about what's the value of sustainable features. And retail are very good, as we were talking about over dinner last night and this morning over breakfast. They know all about product placement. They know all about where you spend your time because that's their business. You don't track office workers the same way retailers track shoppers. And all you have to do is talk to the retailers and say, we absolutely get it, and we think that the things that you want to see done in the buildings for an environmental point of view are the same things that we want to put into buildings from a business point of view. And once you get that, it gets very, very interesting. Just a couple of things I won't spend on them because we've got to move on. But there are on that website, which is the Better Places for People campaign, lots of guidance notes around this. Easy ways, as I mentioned yesterday, for you to begin to dip into this. And really, it is the case where you just point out some easy ways to engage with this framework, and it becomes apparent to people that actually it is not that difficult to take on. It's a pretty low-cost, high-value proposition. And if you want more information, that's where it's at. And if you particularly want to participate or get involved, I'd be really interested in talking with you. Lots of hands help with the work. Thanks.